Hello and welcome to Formations Events, a series of public events focused on global inequalities led by Jenny Ramone for Nottingham Trent University's Postcolonial Studies Centre in collaboration with Nottingham's Bonington Gallery. We hope you will enjoy, you will join us for events throughout the year. You can watch last year's and this year's events on the YouTube channel. Please do subscribe to Bonington Gallery's Formations YouTube channel. This month, we discuss indigeneity, and tonight's event is one of a series of events connected with our film screening of the award-winning Australian documentary film, In My Blood It Runs. Tonight's special event is a conversation between Dani Louise Olver, Ngahuia Harrison, and me. My name is Valentina de Riso, and I'm a doctoral researcher at Nottingham Trent University, working on contemporary writings by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women. Ngahuia Harrison is an artist and doctoral candidate at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She comes from Northland New Zealand tribes. Her lens-based doctoral research is looking at the effects of marine legislation upon her tribe. Dani Olver is a Midlands for Cities doctoral researcher at Nottingham Trent University in England. Her research focuses on contemporary US and Canadian Indigenous school stories and how authors deploy and subvert the conventions of young adult school stories to unmask and confront enduring colonial legacies in educational contexts. So today we come together to discuss In My Blood It Runs in the broader context of Indigenous studies, with attention paid to topics of education, justice, history, memory, language, and Indigenous resistance. This event lasts about 1 hour, and we are delighted that you can join us. Please note that tonight's event includes live automated closed captioning generated via Teams, and that this may include some mistakes. Just before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the realities represented in the film take place in Australia, but they're also part of the historical imprint of the UK and its legacy of imperialism and colonialism. So it is important that we engage in these conversations in the hope that they may inform public perceptions of colonial relationships, which are otherwise often poorly understood beyond stereotypes and misconceptions. So for those of you who may not have seen the film yet, In My Blood It Runs is a collaborative documentary that illustrates what it means to grow up as an Indigenous person in Australia through the story of Dujuan, a 10-year-old Arrernte healer living in Alice Springs. Dujuan is held in high esteem by his family and his tribe because of his healing powers and his wisdom, but the Western education system does not value this knowledge and instead punishes him for not conforming to Western standards. As a result, he struggles in school and faces increasing surveillance from child welfare and police. In My Blood It Runs is a powerful indictment of Australian society and its treatment of Indigenous peoples, and it's much more than a film because it is a campaign for change that is guided by the Indigenous families and communities behind the film. And so for a start of our conversation, I'd like to ask both of you, Ngahuia and Dani, what is it in the film or the making of the film that made a strong impression for you?
I don't mind going first. Well, firstly, I think your choice of words was very correct there, and the word's powerful. I think it is a very powerful documentary, and I think for a lot of people it'll be very eye-opening into realities that are hidden from the public eye.
Thanks, Dani.
Yeah, thanks. Well, firstly, I just actually wanted to start by acknowledging tēnei te mea aroha ki ngā tangata whenua o ahi Australia, ngā whenua moemoeā, kia kaha, kia maia, kia manoa nui ka koutou. So I just wanted to acknowledge the Aboriginal people of Australia and their struggles, acknowledge their lands and their peoples and their resources, and that they never ceded sovereignty of their lands and their ways of life. I guess for me, what struck me with the film is as Australia is our neighbour, our closest neighbour here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it always surprises me the different struggles that Aboriginal people have to deal with compared to what we as Maori deal with in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Not saying that it's a bed of roses in New Zealand for Maori people, far from it, but definitely the oppression that Aboriginal people have to deal with is incredibly violent and daily. And I think is what Dani has said about this would be really eye-opening for people to witness the daily oppression that Aboriginal people in Australia have to live with, have to learn how to cope with and survive. And even though we are so close geographically, in New Zealand, it's something that you know about, you're aware of because of our relationship with Australia, but you're not thinking about it all the time. So for me, it was a really powerful reminder of not just what Aboriginal people have to survive under, but the ways in which they actually do resist and survive, which is, beyond admirable.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with what both of you said. And for me, I think that I really liked how central the family was to the film. And I like that Dujuan's families collaborated in the making of the film, and they had agency in what kinds of messages to share on screen. I really like that. And I liked that we have Dujuan's perspective, and his voice and his presence is really emphasized in the film. It's the core, and it's not a perspective that we get to see very often. It's not very often represented, and I really like those scenes where he is holding the camera and he interviews his family members. So yes, I liked how he has agency, and so this reinforces the messages then about the importance of listening to children and Indigenous children specifically. And yes, and in this way it acts like a counter narrative, and so the object of study that is scrutinized is actually the Australian government. I really like that it forces us to see that. Scrutinize the school system, the education system and the criminal justice system. And in so doing, I think it is decolonized. I liked that it was decolonizing in that way. So it offers a different perspective, and it dispels some of the colonial myths about Indigenous families as well, like the racist assumption that Indigenous parents are not fit to raise their kids. And it actually shows that it puts on the foreground how much Indigenous parents care and love for their kids, and actually how it's society's problem. It's not Dujuan's who fails at school, it's the school that fails Dujuan. I like how that was really foregrounded in the film.
Yeah, definitely. That idea of, that's such a integral part of the colonial project, is to dehumanize, create an other and then dehumanize that other. And it's really heartbreaking that, mothers, grandmothers, fathers, uncles, aunties have to, we've created a situation where people like that have to make a movie and say, no, we love our children. We're capable of love.
Yeah.
The fact that is something that Indigenous people have to witness and even have to articulate is such an indictment to me on our governments, on our state systems, and on the people that have dehumanized us, because it doesn't say anything about our humanity. It actually says something about theirs.
Yeah, I definitely think the family love pushes back against the spectre of taking children away that haunts all of the people throughout the documentary, because it affects every single person.
Mm.
Yes. Another thing that I liked was as well I thought the title of the film was really nice too, and powerful, and also like the way then that concept was used throughout the film. And so the film begins and ends with a mention of how history and memories flow through blood, and he introduces the story. Dujuan himself introduces this story with this, and the idea of history being written into the body reminds me of the concept of blood memory, which first circulated in Scott Mamaday's novel Housemaid of Dawn, and the film uses it. Perhaps not this concept specifically, but this idea of embodied memory, it uses it almost a little bit as a framing device, because it starts and ends with a mention to it, and then we see so many clips of and images. We see images both of past trauma and violence, images of schools, residential schools and missions and other colonial institutions, but also images of Indigenous resistance, images of protests for language revitalization. And these are all memories that Dujuan has not lived through necessarily, but that are alive in him. So I liked how that worked out as well.
Yeah, the intergenerational nature of it really shows through in it. It shows through his anger as well.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And then we see it as well, how this knowledge and history that runs through his veins is not legitimized or accepted or recognized by the education system, the Western education system. And we see it especially in those seen shot in the school. So there's one, a history class where a teacher teaches Australian history, which is actually colonial history, with an outdated book, a 1950s book. And then another class where a teacher ridicules Indigenous beliefs when she's supposed to be teaching them. What did you think of those scenes?
Those scenes make me very uncomfortable. And that speaks to the power of this documentary to share how that makes a young boy such as Dujuan feel, especially when they belittle their own culture and history. And I think the teacher says, I don't understand it. And it's like, you were in a powerful position, and it's just really upsetting, really.
Yeah, I love that. See, I mean, it kind of makes me, his spirit really, you know, there's a kind of trickster playfulness about him, and in that scene where he sort of says, "Spirit's real, miss." I love that, just claiming without ever having to evidence, like, this is a real knowledge system. Of course it's a real knowledge system. And I mean, again, I think it speaks to the differences, can you speak from my position as a Māori, but the differences between what we have to contend with as Māori people and with our neighbours, the Aboriginal people. But in New Zealand, there's, next year they are finally including New Zealand history into the curriculum, in New Zealand history in terms of the settler Māori relationship, as well as including what is being described as Mātauranga Māori, which I guess broadly translates as like Māori knowledge. And there's been a lot of there's been a lot of kickback. I mean, obviously, we are so much further along in terms of our relationship with our government that we are able to even put this into the primary and secondary curriculum. But earlier this year, there was a group of academics from the university that I study at, the University of Auckland, who penned a public open letter dismissing the inclusion of Mātauranga Māori, or its relationship as it sits, as they see it, as it sits next to Western science. There were a group of academics from mostly the science faculty at the University of Auckland. Now, there's a lot of academics that also came back, and other people that, pushed back against their letter, but it definitely shows that tension, I think, the fear of including this knowledge, and speaks to that fear of what that, I think, the same space where the teacher is talking from in the film is where these academics are speaking from. It's fear of, I mean, many things, but I think perhaps the base of it, the fear of a guilt, perhaps, that is going to be brought up, and having to face a sort of, I don't like the word true, but a more realistic understanding of how a settler colonial nation was formed, because there's no other way to cut it, but it's formed off the back of theft and exploitation and attempted genocide of Indigenous people. And we can't change that, but you can face it. And her dismissal of it in the film it was almost comic to me. And his response to that kind of made me smile, because it was like, yeah, it is real. Like, it's comic that she could be so ignorant. And I guess that's the importance of teaching this knowledge. It's like that Fred Moten thing. You just have to recognize, the shit is killing you too, if not more softly, to not face this sickness, to not diagnose the illness. We're never going to heal from it. And it's going to make you, continue sort of violent acts, or at the best case, like this teacher, just look a bit stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was watching that scene, I cringed, and it was she kept saying that she didn't understand it. It was she speaks of it dismissively, and then she says, "I don't understand it, but we've got to believe it," or something like that. And then she asks, another thing is, she asks the students if they understand it, but doesn't wait to listen to what they say or to be taught by them. Because the thing is, Dujuan is probably in that class is probably the expert on that topic, himself being a healer. But yes, even when he protests, as you said, he says spirit is real, but he's not listened to. And another thing that I thought while watching this is also that, so this is a documentary, and these are also supposed to be the very good schools that are invested in, that want to support Indigenous children. And probably the teacher was happy to be filmed. She seems fine with being filmed. So probably kind of like some lack of awareness as well. But watching those scenes also, especially, well, actually the history class also, the use of an outdated book also reminded me of an article that I read last month, I think, or maybe it was the month before, I can't remember now, but and it was about an A-level textbook used in the UK to teach American history. And so the book was looking at a period in history between the 1800s and the 1900s, and it was a period in time where Native Americans were treated horribly. Wounded Knee happened at that time, and but this textbook included an exercise that asked students to criticize but also defend the treatment of Native Americans as if it's actually exaggerated, suggesting that perhaps it's exaggerated. And then the same publisher, like 2 months, maybe not 2 months before that, but a few months before that, was also criticized for including an exercise about it. So this was about the American Civil War, and there was an exercise that suggested that maybe slavery could be justified. And now, obviously, these textbooks have been withdrawn, but it still speaks of the, how racial injustice, like how ingrained it is, and how, it's still problematic in schools, how these things are being discussed in the UK as well. And probably these things are badly discussed kind of across the globe. And I'm also thinking of the American teacher. There was a video that went viral. I don't know if you've seen it, of I think it was in California, a math teacher ridiculing Indigenous cultures during her class, and that's really, really sad. So we see this in the film, and we're aware that it's happening, and it keeps happening in different contexts. And I know what you're saying, Ngahuia, about they have been making efforts to include Indigenous curriculum into or Indigenous perspectives into Western curriculum, or dominantly Western curriculum. And that also is problematic. And we see it in the film, because this is a class about the dreaming. So, and it doesn't work. It clearly, it does not rectify the problems, and it continues the violence, actually. And so we could think about like how, if there are more positive ways maybe of dismantling Western institution as a colonial tool, or navigating that. What do you think of that?
I mean, I always think, well, I mean, again, I can only speak from a New Zealand perspective, but what I see here in our institutions, when people start to talk about decolonizing a university or a school curriculum at whatever level, the knee-jerk reaction is to sort of reach into Te Ao Māori, into Mātauranga Māori, and sort of use that as a band-aid, rather than actually looking at what that wound is underneath, which is that Pākehā people, Pākehās, our European New Zealanders, what their role was historically, and the ways in which they unwittingly or wittingly are complicit in the perpetual colonization of Māori people and lands. But rather than facing that relationship, the knee-jerk is to sort of reach into the Māori world and ask Māori to do that labour by renaming everything, putting Māori names on everything, saying that there will be these XYZ classes or papers as part of the curriculum, but not actually, firstly, offer Māori the autonomy to create that curriculum, but not at the same time have institutions facing up to their part in which they played in colonisation. The lands in which our institutions stand, how those lands came to be in Crown possession. We're a pretty young nation in terms of as a Western nation. New Zealand is a young nation. Aotearoa is much older, but because it's not that hard to find those records. It's not that, probably take you half a day, but people don't want to go there. So that seems to be the attempt at decolonising, which I think just puts a lot of burden back on Indigenous people, where we're still having to deal with, over 200 years of being told, as you say, being learned in being taught in our education system that you're worthless. Not just your knowledge systems are worthless, but you yourself are a useless human being. And that, since our native schools were established in the 1860s, that was the message literally drilled in. Māori weren't equipped for higher learning, so, manual kind of work is what is the path that Māori would be put on. I mean, it was all just a ruse to get more of our land, but today you still see that in the primary, secondary, most Māori don't get to tertiary curriculum. They're put still to this day, well, Māori people, well, you can do woodwork, you can do metalwork, so manual labouring type pathways, which, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not, you can't dictate a whole race of people's ability. It's not your right to do that. So I think that idea, but all of that would mean that our government has to give up control in terms of, at least in terms of Māori ways of being, teaching, learning, and being. And yeah, they don't seem to want to do that.
I think control is a very good term. Like you see in the documentary that these schools have been set up for the Aboriginal children, but the power and the control of the education itself is still in the colonial hand.
Yeah. I was horrified in the documentary. I mean, this is one of the wake-up calls again, those reminders I was talking about for me as a Māori person, that there's even in the Aboriginal schools, language schools, they're only allowed to, it still has to be, a hugely predominant part of the course has to be taught in English. I mean, in New Zealand, we've had Te Reo Māori schools. You can go from kohanga reo, so from your preschool, kindergarten, right through to tertiary, university or college, all in Te Reo Māori. So, yeah, it's just one of those stark differences for me as a Māori person watching that Aboriginal people, that started in the first kura kaupapa Māori was in the early 90s in New Zealand. So we're now seeing the first generation of Māori students who have done their whole education has been in Te Reo Māori. And there's a lot of research that shows like the dips in crime rate for that age bracket and things like that. So the payoff, I guess, when you allow a people to be who they are for the whole country by relinquishing some of that control, how all of us benefit from that. If Māori thrives, the country thrives. If Aboriginal people were allowed to thrive, that country would thrive. But yeah, it's just a racist cesspool.
I think you really notice the difference in the body language of the children as well in these two different educational lessons. They really thrive in one, and you can see their disengagement in the other. So it's almost a shame they're not given that chance.
Yeah, it was very clear, that contrast between English classes. They looked just really boring. You just see Dujuan yawning, and the children also are like they seemed, to me at least, almost afraid to answer sometimes or maybe not afraid, but just not interested in answering when the teacher would ask some questions, or maybe hesitant. But then in the Arrernte classes, which I read, it says in the film that they only have like 30 minutes of Arrernte classes, which is, and you're like, but these are supposed to be for Indigenous children. These schools are supposed to be for them. But then, yes, most of it is in English. And but yeah, I liked how the children were really having fun in the Arrernte classes, and how as well we you can approach language learning, because in those fun classes, language related to activities that they perform on the land and beings on the land. They were learning the names of animals and plants, and while the English classes were very focused on syntax and grammar, and completely disconnected from the environment. So that must be boring for yeah.
I think it's taken a step further as well when they're doing the multiple choice answers and teacher says just fill in any bubble. They're almost given that self-fulfilling prophecy of you're going to fail anyway, which is really horrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we see in the film as well that there is an alternative to that Western education system. When we see when Dujuan goes back to his traditional homeland, and that is that's still schooling because he's learning, but that happens on the land, and the teachers are the elders, and that's probably then. I'm not saying that's the way to dismantle, because I don't know if maybe the effort shouldn't be necessarily in reacting, but and that's where I see Indigenous resurgence is not reactionary to colonialism, but it's focused on just the revitalization of Indigenous culture, and I did see that in those scenes where. Not just when he's learning the language from his grandmothers and other relatives, but also when they tell traditional stories, and he discusses traditional stories with his grandma, and then all those scenes where he's picking bush medicine, and also then later in the film where he reconnects with the land of his father, and he's fishing there and all that. That was very uplifting, even though in all the situation is difficult for Dujuan. He's struggling, but all that, I thought that was really nice and uplifting.
I think that idea, of Indigenous resurgence not being in reaction to the state or the government, the nation, is really important, because it's something that Indigenous people have had to do by default. Because if someone's coming at you to attack you, you have to defend yourself, and that requires a interaction with the attacker. But there is also, I think, there has to be room for that kind of that space where you're allowed to be Indigenous, not in a reactive way to this power that's constantly trying to redefine who you are, and whether that's to that idea of kind of like interpellation, like the idea of like if a cop, yells out at you in the street and you turn and you respond to that, you're kind of recognizing that the power that they have. And so trying to build the strength not to turn, I guess, like that's a really important thing for Indigenous people to do, because it diminishes this just this given power that the state has, which, you know, is as fallible as, I mean, it's incredibly vulnerable. I think that's why state is usually afraid to teach proper history. Why the state is afraid to relinquish any control and any power, because there's such an insecurity. I guess that idea of, like, what we were talking about before, it doesn't say anything about Indigenous humanity. It says much more about the state's lack of humanity. So there's a real insecurity in the state's position. And yeah, I think there's just something that's a really important, and we see it in the film. I mean, I guess it's shown, yeah, like physically or geographically at least, where Dujuan goes to his father's land and is given that space to be and to have that ability to be resilient and to resist without even having to recognize for even just a week or a day the state's sort of claws over you, or hold over you, control over you.
Yes, and as Dani said before, Dujuan is angry, and it's understandable. His reactions are responses to the situation he's living, and the scene where he's shown his school report is a really tough one, I think, because he's labeled as a bad student. He's getting bad marks, bad grades, and it says that he remains below standard, but whose standard that is. So that standard is it's a colonial standard, and it just serves to maintain the status quo by making him feel like that as well, by making him feel that he is a failure, and sort of like forcing him to pursue someone else's objectives, but he rebels and he's like, no. Although there is that scene was kind of hard to watch, because he is at first he doubts himself before getting angry and protesting. There's, as soon as he reads the reports, he doubts himself, and he thinks to himself that maybe he said, like, there must be something wrong with me or something like that. And that's how colonialism works as well. So his behavior in response of all that, it's really understandable, I think, and I like the way how his family deals with that, because the family is worried, obviously, for him, and when he runs away from home, and they go out at night in the car looking for him, and then he's always brought back home and is not punished, because there's always this threat of the detention centers lingering, but at home is not punished, is not abused or anything, and actually they perform like healing on him as well. They bring into his other grandmother, who's a traditional healer, and she heals him, and that's really an act of care, and that was beautiful as well, I think, to see.
Yeah, I think actually, picking up on what you're saying, Valentina, it's like that the idea of Dujuan being sent to his father's land, not only did it sort of have, I guess, sort of benefits in terms of his learning and teaching, but it is actually, and the sort of protection of that way, of what we were just talking about, giving him sort of space to just be, but it's also giving him space to live, like to quite literally live, because the detention centres and the rate of Aboriginal deaths in custody in Australia is disgusting. And, you know, the Royal Commission did an inquiry on the detention centres, and I think at the time the film was made, it was all the detention centres were full of Aboriginal children. And that fear is so palpable in his auntie, his nannies and his grandmother, and then there's the woman that's around him, because if he gets picked up, it's not just a night in the cells like it might be for some people, for white Australians. It's potential death. And that fear is so palpable in them, and so they have to remove him. So I guess that his father's land becomes a sanctuary, not just learning and teaching, but actually for living. Which is, you know, it's 2021, and this is how the Australian government treat their Indigenous people. It's horrific.
Yeah. Dani, did you want to add anything on this?
I think you summed it up really perfectly, to be honest. Yeah. But yeah, I think naturally he has a very turbulent personality because of the hardships he's having to endure. But you really see him start to calm himself and feel almost at peace with himself and his identity when he's on his father's land and when he's free from those negative pressures.
Yeah. And I was also thinking that he is very vocal and very direct about what he wants. And there's a point in the film where he says, "This film is about me, and what I think is stop taking kids away." And that's very powerful as well. And because removal of Indigenous children from their families, sometimes I think many settlers think that that's something of the past, that's something that used to happen in residential schools and missions. But actually, it's not. It's still happening. It's still a contemporary issue. There's overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the child welfare, and this is evident in the film as well. And it also seems that the school system feeds into the child welfare system, which feeds into the criminal justice system, because once his report says that he's a bad student, it's like automatically he is labeled like at risk of engaging in criminal. So basically the school criminalizes him in a way, and so then he risks being taken away from his family. And it's just like just how the mechanism of colonialism work, and the fact that his mom says that if he doesn't go to school, her welfare payments are cut. That's another thing that really struck me, because it's punishing the parents and it's forcing them to depend on the system, which continues to hurt them. And yes, that's just
the institutional nature is really emphasized, and you can see how it fuels the cycle. Yes.
And that kind of that idea of fieri, of false generosity, it's like, well, we give you welfare, we give you an Aboriginal school, but it's false generosity because they've created a system, as you say, from cradle to the grave. As an Indigenous person, you are lined up to go through state institutions, whether that's being removed. I mean, yeah, I totally agree with what you see. People think that uplift and displacing children is a thing of the past. I mean, that still happens to Maori children today. You know, our child state ministry, they under investigation at the moment for, turning up to hospitals of young Māori mothers who've just given birth and taking the child off them. So, I mean, that's happening at the moment in this country, a country that's kind of put out there as having, really great relationships with its Indigenous people. But I mean, if the benchmark is Australia, then, it's hardly a standard you want to be working by. And if we are supposedly some sort of model of good relationships, then, it horrifies me to think what it's like in other countries then, because, the uplifting children is happening here in New Zealand. And then, as you say, that child starts in foster care and it goes to a school where often they are by default criminalized. I think that's a really good way of putting it. And then, that's how you're treated. That's often what happens. You have kids who are told they're useless, they're worthless, they're criminals. And then the state sort of acts surprised because it gave you all this false generosity. But really, in the background, creating the structures and creating the situation for Indigenous people to be, in this country, it's Māori women is the highest rates of incarceration. In fact, internationally, we have some of the highest rates of incarceration. Here we are, the kind of bastion of good Indigenous relationships, and 64% of Māori women are in, make up the prison population here. And that's not something that happened by accident at all.
No, absolutely. Yes, there are extremely high rates of incarceration for especially youth in Canada as well, Indigenous youth. And I'm also thinking of Indigenous women who are missing and murdered. And again, that's not happening by chance. That's systemic. And so they are targeted, and we see it in the film that the justice system targets Indigenous children, and that's these detention centres are really horrible places. They're tortured in there, and I was almost surprised that those images were shown in television. And then the narrative around that was also very strong, because the news people, you would hear them saying that that extreme measures were taken because camouflaged, specialized police with military-grade weapons were being sent to patrol the street at night at Alice Springs, and that's just. So those are like counterterrorism, and so that's just another, just very extreme measures to deal, and not even maybe to deal, but just to continue to target Indigenous peoples, and ultimately it just shows that the state is really attempting to, what we know, which is erasing Indigenous presence through all these institutions, which are all connected, and yes, it's disheartening.
I'd agree with you that the level of violence shown was quite shocking to watch. And it's something that people have been talking about from Indigenous communities, but it's been pushed back, it's been ignored, it's been shoved off, and now suddenly they can't ignore it because there's a piece of evidence.
Yeah, that's Yeah, it's so funny, right? Like, it's now that there's video evidence or photographic evidence, suddenly it's true, but Indigenous people, Aboriginal people have been saying that this is happening in their communities. And I feel like, I mean, all of this kind of amounts to, you know, exactly what you're saying. It's because the lack of value on Indigenous life, because I think often Indigenous people are the thorn in the side of settler colonial governments. Like, we undermine your whole narrative or mythology of how you came to be as powerful as you are and how you came to be as brilliant as you are. And it's a lot uglier, the truth of it. And that's not me really even putting any value on it. It's just the need for non-Indigenous people to recognise that. And I guess that goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of how institutions can decolonise, but there has to be a recognition of not the sort of state or non-Indigenous people in settler colonial nations' implicit part in these histories. You know, no one's trying to kind of genocide themselves. It's like, you know, someone else is coming in, but we don't name it. We don't listen to it when there's no evidence, where you can't see it. We create these structures that are so embedded, it's hard to kind of pull them apart and show and sort of display them or present them. And so it's allowed to tick over.
Yes, and I like the fact that this film is also a campaign for change, and the families are also involved on, well, they're involved in different campaigns, but one of them, I can't remember the name now, but it supports Indigenous students. So it's like a journey which lasts about 20 years, I think. So it's like educating holistically one student for 20 and just supporting him or her for 20 years. And that's beautiful. And again, that's decolonizing, because many people wouldn't think of, you know, education necessarily in those terms. And it's really important. And Dujuan also spoke at the United Nations, which was also really inspiring, I think. And again, he emphasized there as well that he was doing his work, including the film, but also speaking at the United Nations, because the Australian government doesn't listen, and especially to children. And so that's why he was doing this. So there's, I like the idea of like emphasizing this importance of listening and listening carefully to Indigenous people, to children, because then again, even in school, settler colonial strategies position the child as less believable, less reliable. But we see in the film many instances in which it's Dujuan who would be most reliable in those specific contexts, if just the teachers would listen to him, but they don't. Yes.
I found that as well. I found that I wanted someone to give the power to Dujuan, to let him be a student leader and let him speak his own truth.
Yes.
That's kind of the most beautiful thing, about the film to me, is that, or like what Newell's done is, she's not an Indigenous person, but there is a lot of agency from the people in the film, or the families in the film, and Dujuan himself and his voice. Like, for me, it was, I mean, you're dealing with such ugly and dark issues, but it was a really hopeful. There was so much hope in the film, and I think that really speaks to him, but also more broadly, kind of those ideas of Indigenous resilience. I mean, the flip side of being kind of beaten down for so long is that you become such an incredibly strong people. And I think that she captured that in the film. I imagine it's probably difficult working with someone like Dujuan not to show his strength or not to have that kind of be front and center. But yeah, I thought that especially from an Aboriginal point of view, I mean, even in New Zealand, there's kind of rhetoric around, like, especially in terms of the sort of discovery of Australia and New Zealand by Cook, and the differences in the way that Maori and Aboriginal people interacted with that first voyage, in particular, the Endeavour, and is sort of used as evidence as to why Maori people are so kind of fierce and outspoken and all the rest of it, because, you know, Cook, the Endeavour appeared and we were out there in our waka, in our canoes, and sort of challenging, whereas what's used as evidence about Aboriginal people is that, you know, Cook left things on the shore, and Aboriginal people, you know, just left, that they were untouched. And also, I guess Australia also had the concept of Terra Nullius, which wasn't incorporated in the sort of colonisation explicitly in the colonisation of New Zealand, but those kinds of ways that Aboriginal people have been framed as sort of docile nomads that sort of didn't really care that they were being taken, you know, didn't put up a fight. So, which is just so incorrect, but I suppose makes non-Indigenous Australians feel good about themselves. But what is so amazing and hopeful about the film is that that is not what we see with Dujuan and his family, as incredibly active, fighting, loving, you know, human beings. And I thought, yeah, that to me is why the film itself is so incredible, is the hope in it and representing Aboriginal as not how they've been defined traditionally.
Thank you for putting it so eloquently, and I think it's the perfect way to come to an end as well, with this very hopeful note. And yes, I agree that there are a lot of hopeful messages in the film, and Indigenous resistance, as shown in the film as well. It's really inspiring, and I love those scenes where with the grandmother as well. And as you said, that's just love, and it's really nice. Yes. So just to wrap up, is there anything that you would like to say? Anything else? If we're good, then I would just like to thank Jenny Ramon, and the Postcolonial Studies Centre at NTU and the Bonington Gallery for having us today. And thank you to both of you, Dani and Ngahuia. I really, really enjoyed our conversation. And I hope that who's watching enjoyed the film and our discussion. And thank you all for listening.